The 101 Dalmatians by Dodie Smith. Illustrated by Michael Dewing. Read by Paul May. Chapter 1. The Happy Couples. Not long ago, there lived in London a young married couple of Dalmatian dogs named Pungo and Mrs. Pungo. Mrs. had added Pungo's name to her own on their marriage, but was still called Mrs. by most people. They were lucky enough to own a young married couple of humans named Mr. and Mrs. Dearly, who were gentle, obedient, and unusually intelligent, almost canine at times. They understood quite a number of barks. The barks for out please, in please, hurry up with my dinner, and what about a walk? And even when they could not understand, they could often guess, if looked at soulfully or scratched by an eager paw. Like many other much-loved humans, they believed that they owned their dogs, instead of realizing that their dogs owned them. Pungo and Mrs. found this touching and amusing, and let their pets think it was true. Mr. Dearly, who had an office in the city, was particularly good at arithmetic. Many people called him a wizard of finance, which is not the same thing as a wizard of magic, though sometimes fairly similar. At the time when this story starts, he was rather unusually rich for a rather unusual reason. He had done the government a great service, something to do with getting rid of the national debt, and as a reward had been left off his income tax for life. Also, the government had lent him a small house on the outer circle of Regent's Park, just the right house for a man with a wife and dogs. Before their marriages, Mr. Dearly and Pungo had lived in a bachelor flat, where they were looked after by Mr. Dearly's old nurse, Nanny Butler. Mrs. Dearly and Mrs. had also lived in a bachelor flat. There are no such things as spinster flats, when they were looked after by Mrs. Dearly's old nurse, Nanny Cook. The dogs and their pets met at the same time, and shared a wonderfully happy double engagement. But they were all a bit worried about what was to happen to Nanny Cook and Nanny Butler. It would be all right when the Dearlys started a family, particularly if it could be twins, with one twin for each nanny. But until then, what were the nannies going to do? For though they could cook breakfast and provide meals on trays, meals called a nice egg by the fire, none of them was capable of running a smart little house in Regent's Park, where the Dearlys hoped to invite their friends to dinner. And then something happened. Nanny Cook and Nanny Butler met, and after a few minutes of deep suspicion, took a great liking to each other, and they had a good laugh about their names. "What a pity we're not a real cook and butler," said Nanny Cook. "Yes, that's what's needed now," said Nanny Butler. And then they both together had the great idea. Nanny Cook would train to be a real cook, and Nanny Butler would train to be a real butler. They would start the very next day and be fully trained by the wedding. "But you'll have to be a parlour maid, really," said Nanny Cook. "Certainly not," said Nanny Butler. "I haven't the figure for it. I shall be a real butler. And I shall valet Mr. Dearly, which will need no training, as I've done it since the day he was born." And so when the Dearlys and the Pungos got back from their joint honeymoon, there were Nanny Cook and Nanny Butler, fully trained, ready to welcome them into the little house facing Regent's Park. It came as something of a shock that Nanny Butler was wearing trousers. "Wouldn't a black dress with a nice frilly apron be better?" suggested Mrs. Dearly, rather nervously, because Nanny Butler had never been her nanny. "You can't be a butler without trousers," said Nanny Butler firmly. "But I'll get a frilly apron tomorrow. It will add a note of originality." It did. The nannies said they no longer expected to be called Nanny, and were now prepared to be called by their surnames, in the correct way. But though you can call a cook, cook, the one thing you cannot call a butler is butler. So in the end, both nannies were just called Nanny Darling, as they always had been. After the dogs and the Dailies had been back from their honeymoons for several happy weeks, something even happier happened. Mrs. Daly took Pungo and Mrs. across the park to St. John's Wood, where they called on their good friend, the splendid veterinary surgeon. She came back with the wonderful news that the Pungos were shortly to become parents. Puppies were due in a month. The nannies gave Mrs. a big lunch to keep her strength up, and Pungo a big lunch in case he should feel neglected, as the fathers of expected puppies sometimes do. And then both dogs had a long afternoon nap on the best sofa. By the time Mr. Daly came home from business, they were wide awake and asking for a walk. "Let's all go for a walk to celebrate," said Mr. Daly, after hearing the good news. Nanny Cook said the dinner was well ahead, and Nanny Butler said she could do with a bit of exercise. So off they all set along the outer circle. The Dailies led the way. Mrs. Daly, very pretty in the green going-away suit from her trousseau, and Mr. Daly in his old tweed jacket, which was known as his dog-walker. Mr. Daly wasn't exactly handsome, but he had the kind of face you don't get tired of. Then came the Pungos, looking noble. They could both have become champions if Mr. Daly had not felt that dog shows would bore them. And him. They had splendid heads, fine shoulders, strong legs, and straight tails. The spots on their bodies were jet black and mostly the size of a 2-shilling piece. They had smaller spots on their heads, legs, and tails. Their noses and eye rims were black. Mrs. had a most winning expression. Pungo, though a dog born to command, had a twinkle in his eye. They walked side by side with great dignity, only putting the Dailies on leash to lead them over crossings. Nanny Cook, plump in her white overall, and Nanny Butler, plumper in a well-cut tailcoat and trousers, plus dainty apron, completed the procession. It was a beautiful September evening, windless, very peaceful. The park and the old cream-painted houses facing it basked in the golden light of sunset. There were many sounds, but no noises. The cries of playing children and the whir of London's traffic seemed quieter than usual, as if softened by the evening's gentleness. Birds were singing their last song of the day, and farther along the circle, at the house where a great composer lived, someone was playing the piano. "I shall always remember this happy walk," said Mr. Daly. At that moment, the peace was shattered by an extremely strident motor horn. A large car was coming towards them. It drew up at a big house just ahead of them, and a tall woman came out onto the front door steps. She was wearing a tight-fitted emerald satin dress, several ropes of rubies, and an absolutely simple white mink cloak, which reached to the high heels of her ruby-red shoes. She had a dark skin, black eyes with a tinge of red in them, and a very pointed nose. Her hair was parted severally down the middle, and one half of it was black, and the other white, rather unusual. "Why, that's Cruella de Vil," said Mrs. Daly. "We were at school together. She was expelled for drinking ink." "Isn't she a bit showy?" said Mr. Daly, and would have turned back. But the tall woman had seen Mrs. Daly and come down the steps to meet her. So Mrs. Daly had to introduce Mr. Daly. "Come in and meet my husband," said the tall woman. You were going out, said Mrs. Daly, looking at the chauffeur, who was waiting at the open door of the large car. It was painted black and white in stripes, rather noticeable. No hurry at all. I insist on your coming. The nanny said they would get back and see about dinner, and take the dogs with them. But the tall woman said the dogs must come in too. They are so beautiful. I want my husband to see them, she said. What is your married name, Cruella? Asked Mrs. Daly, as they walked through a green marble hall into a red marble drawing room. My name is still Deville, said Cruella. I am the last of my family, so I made my husband change his name to mine. Just then, the absolutely simple white mink cloak slipped from her shoulders to the floor. Mr. Daly picked it up. What a beautiful cloak, he said. But you'll find it too warm for this evening. I never find anything too warm, said Cruella. I wear furs all the year round. I sleep between ermine sheets. How nice, said Mrs. Daly politely. Do they wash well? Cruella did not seem to hear this. She went on. I worship furs. I live for furs. That's why I married a farrier. Then Mr. Deville came in. He was a small, worried-looking man who didn't seem to be anything besides a farrier. Cruella introduced him and then said, What are those two delightful dogs? Pongo and Mrs. were sitting under the grand piano, feeling hungry. The red marble walls had made them think of slabs of raw meat. They're expecting puppies, said Mrs. Daly happily. Oh, they are. Good, said Cruella. Come here, dogs. Pongo and Mrs. came forward politely. Wouldn't they make enchanting fur coats, said Cruella to her husband, for spring wear over a black suit. We've never thought of making coats out of dog skins. Pongo gave a sharp, menacing bark. It was only a joke, dear Pongo, said Mrs. Daly, patting him. Then she said to Cruella, I sometimes think they understand every word we say. But she did not really think it, and it was true. That is, it was true of Pongo. Mrs. did not understand quite so many human words as he did, but she understood Cruella's joke and thought it was a very bad one. As for Pongo, he was furious. What a thing to say in front of his wife when she was expecting her first puppies. He was glad to see Mrs. was not upset. You must dine with us next Saturday, said Cruella to Mrs. Daly. And as Mrs. Daly could not think of a good excuse, she was very truthful. She accepted. Then she said they must not keep the Devilles any longer. As they went throughout the hall, a most beautiful white Persian cat dashed past them and ran upstairs. Mrs. Daly admired it. I don't like her very much, said Cruella. I'd drown her if she wasn't so valuable. The cat turned on the stairs and made an angry spitting noise. It must have been at Pongo and Mrs., but then again, it might not. I want you to hear my new motor horn, said Cruella, as they all went down the front steps. It's the loudest horn in England. She pushed past the chauffeur and sounded the horn herself, making it last a long time. Pongo and Mrs. were nearly deafened. Lovely, lovely dogs, Cruella said to them as she got into the striped black and white car. You'd go so well with my car and my black and white hair. Then the chauffeur spread a sable rug over the Devilles' knees and drove the striped car away. "That car looks like a moving zebra crossing," said Mr. Dearly. "Was your friend's hair black and white when she was at school?" "She was no friend of mine. I was scared of her," said Mrs. Dearly. "Yes, her hair was just the same. She had one white plait and the other black." Mr. Dearly thought how lucky he was to be married to Mrs. Dearly and not to Cruella de Vil. He felt sorry for her husband. Pongo and Mrs. felt sorry for her white cat. The golden sunset had gone now, and the blue twilight had come. The park was nearly empty, and a park keeper was calling, all out," in a faraway voice. There was a faint scent of hay from the sun-scorched lawns, and a weedy, watery smell from the lake. All the houses on the outer circle that had been turned into government offices were now closed for the night. No light shone on their windows. But the Dearlys could see welcoming lights in their own windows, and soon Pongo and Mrs. sniffed an exquisite smell of dinner. The Dearlys liked it too. They all paused to look down through the iron railings at the kitchen. Although it was in the basement, this was not at all a dark kitchen. It had a door and two large windows opening onto one of the narrow paved yards, which are so often found in front of old London houses. The correct name for these little basement yards is the area. A narrow flight of steps led up from the area to the street. The Dearlys and the dogs thought how very nice their brightly lit kitchen looked. It had white walls, red linoleum, and a dresser on which was blue-spotted china. There was a new-fashioned electric stove for the cooking, and an old-fashioned kitchen fire to keep the nannies happy. Nanny Cook was basting something in the oven, while Nanny Butler stacked plates on the lift, which would take them up through the dining-room floor, as if delivering the Demon King in a pantomime. Near the fire were two cushioned dog baskets, and already two superb dinners in shining bowls were waiting for Pongo and Mrs. "I hope we haven't tired Mrs.," said Mr. Dearly as he opened the front door with his latchkey. Mrs. would have liked to say she had never felt better in her life. As she could not speak, she tried to show how well she felt, and rushed down to the kitchen, lashing her tail. So did Pongo, looking forward to his dinner and a long firelit snooze beside his dear Mrs. "I wish we had tails to wag," said Mr. Dearly.